It's lovely to have you all there in the webinar. And I'm particularly delighted that in helping us explore human learning systems and how we can transform public services, I'm joined by Dawn Plimmer from Collaborate CIC, by David Barr from Aberlour Child Care Trust, and by Lowis Charfe from the University of Central Lancashire, all of whom have got lots of insights into human learning systems and how that might help us in our social pedagogical practice. So the webinar is basically structured in the following way. As usual, I'll give a quick outline of the concept, and then we'll have a little fishbowl discussion with David, Dawn, and Lewis before we then move into a wider exploration with you all to identify what are the key learning points for practice. So I hope that sounds all right with people. And to begin with, I think the reason why we're interested in human learning systems from a social pedagogical perspective is because it helps us really kind of grapple in a constructive way with the fact that life is complex. I think all too often when I've met practitioners in the UK, there is this hope, this illusion that if we do A, we'll achieve B. If we provide one certain input, we'll achieve one certain outcome. And very often that's all predetermined. And you have all sorts of lovely metrics and systems that kind of support that illusion. And as this picture shows, life is a little bit different. Life is a little bit more complex than that. Even one person's life is a lot more complex than that. So what can we actually do to move towards a practice that values and understands why it depends on the context, why what we do really depends on who we support, how we support them, and who else is part of their life. So that's an important starting point, I think, and which is why we need something that is much more complexity informed. And this is where human learning systems, I think, can really help, because it is very much based on an understanding that the world is complex and we need something that helps us make sense of that complexity and to navigate it. To begin with, human learning systems is very much focusing on the human, so making sure that our practice and public service in general are grounded in a clear moral purpose to support people to flourish, to thrive, to have as much freedom as possible within their community. And so that's where relationships become really, really important, and where the link with social pedagogy is quite obvious, because in social pedagogy, we also talk about the importance of treating people as fully rounded human beings, as intrinsically rich and resourceful, and our role being to support human flourishing. So there's a great overlap, and where we feel that social pedagogy can offer concepts around the 3 Ps, the professional, personal, and private self, that enable us to build more meaningful relationships with people, or the common third that helps us to use activities to build more equitable relationships and learn together. The next thing within human learning systems then is around learning and the importance of constantly learning, constantly exploring, constantly being in dialogue with the people we support to better understand their life, to learn more about that, and to explore with them what might make a meaningful difference in their life. What can we actually do to be supportive? So actually, it is both about supporting people in learning within their lives, but also about us as a service, as an organization, as part of the system, constantly being interested in learning and in developing and growing our understanding, deepening our understanding of people's lives and the communities we support, and so forth. So that's where human learning systems argues that learning needs to become our management strategy. As an organization, as teams, we need to have the kinds of systems in place that enable us to go through learning cycle, to experiment, to see what kind of difference does it make if we try something different today than we did yesterday, and to constantly evaluate that so that we can draw on the learning and try out something new to be responsive to complex environments in that sense. And again, I think social pedagogy has a lot to offer in that respect, because it is very much around learning and what can we do to support people's learning through ideas around multiple intelligences, or ideas around the learning zone model, etc., that can help us in that. The third point then in HLS is very much about systems, and recognizing that as human beings, we're always part of systems. We're part of a web of relationships with other people. We have this relational universe that we're part of. And so as professionals, we need to think about the systems at many different levels, really. So we need to think about people's life as a system. And we need to think about, like, who else is part of their life, who else kind of supports certain outcomes in their lives. So assuming that helping a young person achieve 5 GCSEs in their education is just down to me, that would just be kidding myself. Yeah, so I might play an important role in that process, but ultimately the outcome of 5 GCSE, or the lack of that, is very much determined by the entire system that is that young person's life. So by their teacher, by themselves, of course, by other factors that are important, by other actors, by other people that are part of their lives. And the better those relationships are within that system, the greater the likelihood that we actually achieve the outcome that we're after. So we're going to explore a little bit more about that in a moment, because Dawn has some really exciting insights into what does a healthy system look like, and how can we actually work on optimizing systems in that sense, and to give you a couple of case studies. But before we go on to that, I'm going to just briefly introduce David Barr, because as in his role as assistant director with Aberlour Child Care Trust, he's been really influential in putting those ideas into practice. And I think human learning systems, it'd be fair to say, that is very much an iterative kind of paradigm, in that it's grown out of the learning that we've had from organizations that have tried to do things differently, that have tried to get away from new public management and find an alternative paradigm that enables them to focus more on the human relationships, on constantly learning together with the people that are part of the community, and to focus on what can we do to be more collaborative in the way we approach practice. And David's project is probably an interesting case in that point, and has informed the latest ebook on human learning systems. So I'm really delighted to have you on the webinar, David. And yeah, I'll just hand over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Gabriel. I think I'm off mute. Yep, can you hear me okay? Good stuff. Okay, listen, I want to keep this quite brief, but try and use it as an opportunity for something we can go on and say a little more about. So first of all, a little bit about our context in Dumfries and Galloway. Aberlour have been offering whole family support to families affected by parental substance use in Dumfries and Galloway for about 10 years now. Largely, that work has been externally funded. We have the Cora Foundation in Scotland, and they continue to be an important funder. They have a partnership drugs initiative. It's also been funded by a local trust. We've had excellent ongoing support from them. And it's been, to some extent, funded by the local authority. Now, up until, a couple or 3 years ago, we had quite a tricky relationship with the local authority, where what we were seeing was almost a reduction in funds at a time when the impact and demand for the service was growing. I dare say that'll be something that people have experienced elsewhere. Now, what human learning systems have enabled us to do, I think, is to create a new conversation about how we work collaboratively together, how we develop a shared sense of purpose and meaning, and how we find a new way to think about funding and commissioning services with the health board, with the local council. So it's been a really helpful and important journey for us. first became aware of Collaborate and Toby Lowe when the initial report was published in 2017, A Whole New World. And when the subsequent report came out and introduced the idea of human learning systems, I was very keen to find a way of integrating it into our work. Coincidentally, in a previous life, I'd worked very closely with Gabriel and Thempra on social pedagogy. So I mean, I too could see a lot of those connections. What happened was we were speaking to the local authority about transforming children's services. We were speaking to them about the model that we were using, and increasingly we're moving towards including people as much as possible, including families and communities in the development process. We had learned through people volunteering that when we help people move from connecting to communities to contributing to communities towards leading in communities, we can create a big shift and a sustainable change. So we had an opportunity to apply for funding from the Cora Foundation, and that funding was around whole family support system change. And that cue the arrival of Collaborate. I'd been looking for an excuse to work with Annabelle from Collaborate for a wee while. I'd been in touch with her about something else previously. When she came down and outlined the human learning systems approach to our two partners, now our two partners were really significant. The head of service for children and families in the council, and it was the coordinator for the alcohol and drugs partnership. Two people who really had strategic responsibility for thinking about how family support is delivered to families who are affected by substance use. They were really engaged in that discussion. Annabelle came down and it really captured their attention. And we started talking at the same level. There was a new level of I think, shared purpose. There was a new level of trust. Things really fell into place. I'm pleased to say that work then secured us the funding from Cora, and we're now a year into our Families and Communities First project, which has been working closely with our strategic partners, with senior leaders in Dumfries and Galloway, with local stakeholders, and with families and communities. And the first year of that project has really been about initially establishing a state of play and then working through a level of engagement and understanding with senior stakeholders, local stakeholders, families and communities, not necessarily in that order. And what I wanted to try and do in less time than I'm probably managing to do it was highlight some of the learning from that. If you want to see how it was set out, I'm going to put a link into our case study in the chats, or Gabriel can share it, so you can have a look at how we set up the project and what our ambitions were. But one of the first things that we learned was trying to do it in the context of a pandemic was a real challenge. So those initial face-to-face conversations that our partners had with Annabelle, that's where all the energy and the enthusiasm and the direction came from. It was slightly more difficult to carry that through with all of the people that we were talking to in the context of a Teams meeting. We were able to do it, but it was a good example of how we had to think carefully about ensuring we were properly engaging with people. We were getting the information we needed from them. Particularly in new relationships, it's much harder to forge and secure them, I think, through a virtual environment than it is if you're in the same space as someone. But one of the things that happened quite quickly, I think, was it began to change the nature, the culture of the relationship we had with our partners. And one experience I thought I would share is a conversation with Stephen Morgan, who's the head of service for children and families. And he was talking to us about how difficult it had been to deliver service during the pandemic. And they had been having conversations with their social work team, individual conversations with the social work team to talk to them about where they were at. And I remember him sharing in that conversation that in the midst of it, there was huge emotion. There were lives that were in turmoil. There were family challenges. There were people who were seriously ill. There was bereavement. He said, in that moment, I became aware, and we became aware in those conversations, of our shared humanity. Not just our shared humanity with each other, but the extent to which we shared that humanity with the people we support. And it struck me that that was a pivotal moment in illustrating how that new conversation had begun to help us all think differently about how we relate to each other and what that means for the service that we deliver. And I think in following that up, in the work that we were doing with the senior leadership team and in the work that we're doing with local partners, it's helped us to think much more carefully about what lies at the heart of change. And that is recognizing that the strengths and the value that already exists within local families and local communities. We worked very hard with local partners to help them to think about the role that they play in system stewardship, for example. And we've struggled to think about how to communicate that. And actually, that's one of the things that we found it difficult to achieve a shared understanding of in a team's environment. And we've now moved. Annabelle's on maternity leave, and Jenny Lloyd is working with us. And we've looked at a new approach, a learning framework approach. And we're also going to, rather than asking people to come on to more Teams meetings, we're going to meet them individually and have individual conversations and try to understand how they're seeing their experience as someone who's involved actively in conversations about stewarding the system, about changing the system. And I think that what we're seeing is much better collaboration. So we talked at the beginning of the project about the extent to which some of the big systems were siloed and separate. But we recognize that even with small, locally delivered grassroots organizations, they can sometimes find themselves operating in their own style, sometimes out of necessity, because they've all got it like us, try and find funding, try and find space, try and make a case for existing. And I think in the context of the conversations we've had around human learning systems, we've created the opportunity to break down some of those barriers as well and help recognize that we're all working to a shared purpose with a shared set of values. And we've had a number of local events, particularly over the summer when restrictions were not quite as tight as they had been, bringing the local groups together with the people they were supporting and helping them to see that all these people were working together and talking about how we might look at tests of change in the way that we deliver support to families, how we might bring them together to work more actively in supporting our thinking around that. So I'm inclined not to say too much more and maybe leave you to think about what you might want to ask me more about and bring it into the conversation later. Would that be okay, Gabriel?
That sounds great. Yeah, thanks very much, David. That's already given us a good little insight into why this is really powerful stuff and how that sense of shared purpose can really help not just achieve what is often the case, which is, I think what really struck me was that your aim wasn't just to include those families experiencing substance abuse, but actually to help them become more established within their community and to give them more of a leadership role within the project and within their communities as well. That's far off from just trying to get them away from the margins of the community to really kind of help them be at the heart of it. And I think it shows just how powerful our achievements can be when we actually collectively work on supporting leadership in every single individual. So that gives me a nice lead into the notion of leadership and the importance of it and what happens when we think about leadership in everyday terms. So I'll hand over to Lewis from the University of Central Lancashire, where she's the course leader for the MA in Social Pedagogy Leadership. Over to you, Lewis.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Gabriel. And yeah, leading on from what David was talking about, on our MA, we have come across the human learning system and we've embedded it into our leadership course. And I've developed this leadership framework that helps us kind of think about how we use human learning systems and social pedagogy to drive forward positive change and thinking about leadership as well. So when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about like our everyday practice, but also organisational and team change as well. So leadership in the everyday and the organisational. And like David said, it is about starting with that agreed purpose. And so when I first came across human learning systems, it really chimed with me and my understanding of social pedagogy. And for me, I think what we'd start with right in the centre, if you can see there, we have this agreed purpose. So the human learning system gets us to think about the shared moral purpose of all the work that we do in the public sector. And again, that links really nicely with social pedagogy, because it's about our Haltung, about the social pedagogical Haltung of the work that we're doing. And so we need to be anchored to the work that we're doing. So for me, when I was thinking about human learning systems and social pedagogy, and I've developed this framework, I see it as kind of our flagpole. It's the thing that anchors our practice, anchors our leadership and the work that we do. And it gives us a point to keep reflecting back to. So Gabriel made the point right at the beginning that, you know, the world is complex. The work that we do is really complex. There isn't a set answer to some of the, you know, social issues that we are dealing with, some of the support that families need, that adults need. And so it needs to be, we need a much more flexible approach. So if we have this anchor to our agreed purpose in the middle, that's something that we then keep reflecting back on. If we think, are we meeting our purpose? Are we meeting the shared aims that we have? And David talked about, you know, the work that they're doing about this is including people that are on the receiving end of that support and those services, so that these are meaningful and purposeful, and that is really important. Values alive in practice as well. So the VAP, it stands for Values Alive in Practice. And what we talk about there is that if we have this shared understanding, we have this shared moral purpose, we also need our values to be alive in our practice. So where is the behaviour that demonstrates that we are upholding these shared moral values, this shared agreed purpose of the work? So if we're supporting families, so like the project David was talking about, if it's supporting families, how are we doing that? Where is the actual behaviour that demonstrates that we are working collaboratively? And that means, again, that we're anchored to that. And then on the outskirts, because I think that one of the things that struck me when I read the second Human Learning System report was that somebody in the report said, this isn't about anarchy. The human learning system isn't about just like throwing out all the rules and just doing whatever we want, and there isn't complete anarchy. And it really made me think about how on the boundaries of all our work, we have these legal and safeguarding frameworks. So we've got our anchor in the middle, which is our moral purpose, but then the thing that kind of guides and frames the work that all of us do are the legal and safeguarding frameworks that we have to work within. And we really need to be aware of these. These guide the work that they do, they keep us safe and the people that we're supporting safe, but also, you know, they're not disappearing, and they give us a good sense of the work that we need to be doing. So they're kind of the outer boundaries of the work that we're doing. And for us, on our MA, we teach our students about legal and ethical literacy, and how you have to have that really deep level of legal and ethical literacy to understand what is the moral and legal purpose of the work that you're doing, but how can we use legal frameworks and safeguarding frameworks to make sure that people are pushing forward positive change in their lives, that they are, having every opportunity to, to make positive changes. And also, as from a leadership point of view, in organisational change, how can legal and safeguarding frameworks support positive change within organisations as well? So they're really, really important that we understand those wider boundaries of the work that we're doing. And then in the middle, because life is complex and because, we can't have things that are formulaic, they just don't work. Like Gabriel mentioned at the beginning, we've got new public management that says, we've got standardised assessments, standardised packages of care, this works. And we know that they don't. Life is complex. COVID, the pandemic has shown that we need to be much more flexible. So in the middle there, we then have space where we think about where is the space for building up relationships. And again, this can work on an everyday level, so thinking about your everyday practice with people that you're supporting, but also on an organisational level as well. So where are the spaces within the work that we do, within the organisation, within the organisational culture that helps us build relationships? And before we started the webinar, we were talking about commissioning and how the skills that you need to work with children, families, adults, are also the same skills that you need to work with commissioners and partners and other organisations, but you're just using them in a different context. So we need to think about that. So where and what might be some of the social pedagogical theories that help us think about relationship building, so such as the common third and the 3 Ps that give us those boundaries, our professional boundaries. We then think about the space for learning and reflective practice. So again, I think one of the big things for me is that this isn't just about continual professional development. This is about learning from the everyday. So it's using data and outcomes to think about where's our learning. It's working collaboratively with the people that we are supporting, so that there is that co-production and co-learning around what works and you know what works well. And in the human learning system, the framework for reflection, experimentation, I think is really helpful. So again, it's thinking about in our leadership, in our everyday practice and in the organisations, where is the space for learning and reflective practice? How is that built in to the everyday? And then also, where's the space for experimentation and development? So this is links to the hands element of head, heart, hands, the social pedagogy theory. So if we're thinking about our relationships and we're thinking about reflective practice and learning, where is the space for experimentation and development? And thinking about positive error cultures. So thinking about how if something doesn't work, that isn't a failure, that's not something that's gone wrong. It just means that where's the learning from that? We've experimented, we've thought about something, we've tried it and maybe it's not worked as well as we thought, and why might that be? And for me, this really links to some of the key ideas in social pedagogy around imagination, curiosity and creativity. And so it's being able to be, you know, creativity isn't, you know, singing and dancing and art. Creativity, like Ken Robinson talks about, is applied imagination. So it's about how can we think outside the box, how can we use our imagination and apply that so that we can then practice in more creative ways and be confident and feel that we've got the confidence and the skills to try and deal with things in maybe a different way, have a go at something and see if that works. And so, like I say, we keep making sure that we then practice within the legal and safeguarding frameworks, but that we're also keep revisiting back the agreed moral shared purpose. So where is the, you know, are we doing what we said we would do? Where are the values that are alive in our practice that demonstrate that we are actually meeting those shared purposes and goals? So yeah, I think that's everything I've got to say about the framework. And again, like David, you know, we can have more of a discussion about the framework and how I think this can support the development of human learning systems in everyday leadership and organisational leadership.
Perfect, thanks, Lewis. And yeah, I wholeheartedly concur that this is a really helpful way to think about how can we actually create space within our practice, space for relationships, given that they're at the heart of HLS and of social pedagogy, spaces for learning and reflective practice, and spaces where we recognize that we can't just do what we think is the right thing, but actually we need to involve the people that we support. So by default, we can't just implement our own ideas, and we need to work with them to develop something that feels really supportive of their unique context, and picks that up. I think there's also something about, so how can we use a systems perspective in order to achieve that, which is really fascinating, and which is perhaps an idea that we don't always kind of pay too close attention to in our practice. So I'm really delighted that Dawn Plimmer, who's been involved in HLS and the various reports which David mentioned earlier. So she's been involved in this stuff for a very long time now. And I'm really delighted that you're here to share a little bit more about like what is a healthy system and how can we make sure that we help systems become less corrosive, perhaps, for the want of a better word, because very often when I meet practitioners, they do an amazing job despite of the systems that they find themselves in, not because the systems support what they're doing. So actually, the idea of we need to work at the systems level as well. We need to better understand what we mean by systems and how we are part of those systems, how we can influence those systems is really, really important. So I'll pass on to you, Dawn.
Gabriel. So yeah, I wanted to focus on the role of systems. I think Lowis gave a brilliant explanation of the human and learning elements. So picking up on a few things David mentioned about systems, I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. So as Gabriel said at the start, outcomes emerge from complex systems. Single projects, organisations, people don't create outcomes. Outcomes are created by the interaction of all those different actors and factors in our lives. But I think the systems aspect of human learning systems is probably one of the hardest, because it is out of our control as individuals. It requires us to interact with, to influence many broader factors beyond our control. And the question I really wanted to explore is, like, how do we create contexts that grow and sustain this kind of practice that Lowis was talking about? We might be doing brilliant relational learning focused practice over here, but firstly, as Gabriel said, it's probably in spite of the system. We're probably battling against dominant practices, dominant mindsets, commissioning, regulation. So doing this kind of practice is often incredibly tough to do. And secondly, it doesn't maximise the experience for individuals. So if you're an individual getting brilliant relational practice over here, but then over here you're still getting very transactional, standardised support, that doesn't work for individuals either. So I'm really interested in, particularly kind of in places, in local places where people interact with lots of different people, communities, services, how can we create a healthier system which makes this practice the norm, not isolated pockets that people need to fight to do. So as Gabriel said, like, we all know what a corrosive or unhealthy system looks like. They're typically systems that are siloed, competitive, disconnected, don't really put the priorities of individuals at the heart of it. So we've been really exploring, so what does a healthy system look like? So our assumption is that if you have a healthy system, that will mean that positive outcomes for individuals are more likely to emerge. So they're systems which are based on trust and relationships. It's based on deep listening. They're based on learning and experimentation. And it's about people working better together towards shared goals. There's kind of like shared purpose and values that David was talking about. But I guess the world we live in is so wired for organisations, for competition, for that A to B transactional approach. So in all the case studies and examples we've seen, if you're going to create a healthy system, it requires really purposeful work. It requires unwiring a lot of the practices that we're used to, and really consciously trying to rewire them in a more collaborative, human way. And we've kind of used the word system stewardship to name that role or function, or that is about trying to create a healthy system. So we see a system steward as someone or some people or some organisations that take responsibility for trying to nurture a healthier system. So it's not about delivering a project in a standard sense. It is about taking that step back and thinking about how can all of us in the system work better together to achieve better outcomes in the long term. And I think for me, one of the most interesting things about all the examples of system stewardship we've seen is it's not confined to a specific type of actor. We've seen loads of different actors play this role. Sometimes it can be individuals, sometimes it can be organisations or teams, sometimes it can be multiple actors playing this stewardship role. And we've seen charities play this role, groups, individuals. It's not a role that is reserved for one person. I think the most important factor we found in who's best placed to be a system steward is legitimacy. So who in that system is trusted already, who's already displaying these kind of behaviours, who already has good relationships that they can build on. So what I wanted to do now is just share two examples of system stewardship played by very different actors, just to kind of bring to life what this looks like. So one example that we've seen is Liverpool Combined Authority. So in their homelessness work, they acknowledged that the system was incredibly unhealthy. So the Combined Authority sits across 6 different districts, and they realised that the relationship between commissioners and providers was really unhealthy, and in turn that led to a really unhealthy relationship between providers and the people they were supporting. In some ways, they were actually reinforcing the challenges that people at risk of or experiencing homelessness were facing. So Liverpool Combined Authority came across the idea of healthy systems and system stewardship, and thought, actually, this is what we need to do as commissioners. We've recognised we've probably promoted some really unhealthy behaviours. So how do we start to shift that in a different direction? So the assertive outreach team of commissioners really focused on how do we reset. We're contracting for a new set of services for the next few years. How do we do this in a way that is about developing trusted and honest relationships between everyone in the system? How are we led by learning? So instead of focusing on loads of KPIs and targets and really over-specified contracts, how do we give providers a flexibility to do what they think is best and to adapt and change that over time? And they recognise that actually shifting that power dynamic in the commissioner-provider relationship was so central to enabling this kind of practice and creating that space for reflection and learning. So actually what they did was a traditional contract and review officer role, they instead changed to a system stewardship role. And Alex, who played that role, she was all about trying to improve that commissioner-provider relationship. Instead of asking for loads of contract monitoring reports, she actually convened providers, commissioners in the room together to learn and adapt. I think that's a really, they'll be the first to admit they don't have all the answers. They're still testing, learning. You know, obviously the practice of all the districts and boroughs have such an influence as well. And some places have really taken this, some have struggled, but they've seen some real benefits so far of taking this different approach. And the next quite different example I just wanted to briefly touch on was Surrey Youth Focus. So Surrey Youth Focus is a really small infrastructure organisation that supports children and youth in Surrey. It's a voluntary organisation. They've got 6 members of staff. I think it's something like 2 or 3 FTE, but the impact they've had is just amazing. So Kate, their chief exec, was intuitively working in a system stewardship way. When she came into the role, and the broader context was that children's services in Surrey were failing, the system was very disconnected. And Kate just started like building relationships, talking to people, actually calling out things and being quite honest in the way that she communicated how things needed to change. And Surrey Youth Focus have taken this approach, which is very much about how do we help connect and build relationships across the system. And I think one of the things that has really struck me is the way that Surrey Youth Focus have managed to get public sector partners on board by being authentic, by putting the priorities of children and families first, by brokering these connections, by creating different kinds of spaces for people to have different conversations that are actually about how do we listen better and what can we do together to make a difference. So they actually call their work as Surrey Youth Focus system stewardship, and these bullets are what they define as system stewardship. So bringing people together, focusing on, you know, what is our shared understanding, what is our moral purpose that defines all of our work. Really ensuring that the voice of children, young people and families are at the heart of what all partners do. Enacting positive change, that's where the experimentation comes in. How do we actually start to test new ways of working and bringing people together to reflect and improve? So as just a few examples, kind of Kate's formed a really great relationship with Director of Children's Services at the County Council. They've done loads of work together. They've developed a new emotional wellbeing service, working with the NHS and loads of voluntary sector providers that really is based on HLS principles. And one of the developments that I thought was really powerful was And basically Kate, the Director of Children's Services, and a few others came together and like developed this underground movement of leaders. They felt there just wasn't space in the system to have honest conversations about how the system was just not working. So together they kind of spotted those allies in the system and started having these meetings, and developed out of that some time for kids principles. So these principles are now shared by partners across Surrey. These leaders are now working out in the open, having grown the movement, galvanised the support, created the conditions. But I think that's just a really great example of, this stuff is really hard. It's really hard sometimes to carve out the space for these honest conversations. But I think the journey they've been on over the last few years has just had such huge impact, and I think really demonstrates it's not possible in all contexts. It's really hard. You need to value and resource the role of system stewardship. But I think it's a really powerful example of how small voluntary sector organisations really can have a huge influence as system stewards.
Thanks, Dawn. And I think there's something about when you look for allies, when you build relationships with people outside of your own silo, you actually find a lot more people that are fully on board with this idea of we need to change the system, we need to come together, we need to build better relationships across the different agencies and services and so forth. So actually it's very heartening very often. I know it's incredibly hard, it's incredibly time consuming to invest in those relationships, but when you actually do that, you'll find more allies than you might imagine. And I think that's something that we need to really keep at the forefront, because that's the thing that ultimately keeps you going and helps you continue. Is that fair to say, David?
Can I just add something quickly onto the back of that, Stephen, that maybe I'd been hoping to say initially but didn't get round to? It made me think about our project partners as system stewards and how important they are, and particularly in children and family services, the extent to which creating the context for safe relationships. So in order to have challenge, or be open to challenge on both sides, people need to be open to listen. That requires a big shift in culture and practice. And we decided towards the kind of the latter part of our first year, after careful conversation with our project partners, that we would let's focus a little bit. We feel like the senior team is with us. Let's focus a bit on middle managers. Now, the middle managers were the people who in the past probably had felt themselves a bit stuck into competitive siloed working. It's like, this is my space, it's not yours. And a wee bit of that kind of push and shove that can take place when you work in the third sector. When we revisited that at that point, we experienced a complete and I'm not overstating this, a complete transformation in culture and practice, completely new relationships. People who'd been guarded and defensive and inward looking before were open to saying, how can we work with you? How can we make sure we don't duplicate work? How can we share resources? How can we learn from what you're doing, and vice versa in reciprocal relationships? Now, that might sound like I'm at risk of overstating that, but genuinely, in the nature of the work that they're doing, and I think it's down to the commitment of our project partners and the senior leaders in the Health and Social Care Partnership, all of them, that we really are seeing a huge change. There's work to do. It's going to be ongoing. This never ends. But it's really important to, I think, just share that big shifts are possible.
And I guess what strikes me, David, is the fact that you've modelled this system stewardship practice, and now it's starting to filter across others as well.
And also, I'd just like to point out as well is that it is really complex, it's really challenging, it is really difficult, and like Dawn and David are saying, that there are lots of challenges, particularly when people are used to working in certain ways. But that's why that shared purpose and that the ethics of what we're doing is really important. So, when it's really difficult, if you know that this is morally right and ethically right, and there's that shared moral purpose, then that helps you to keep going and know that you're doing the right thing. Whereas I think, under new public management, it just always feels very difficult and it doesn't feel like you're making a difference. And then that can get really disheartening, and you can get worn out and burn out, and people leave, and ultimately the whole thing collapses, or it's not very good, not experiences for anybody. So I think, again, it is, the importance of that, the ethics of all this is really important.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I'm very keen to bring in the rest of our webinar participants. Really keen to hear any reflections or any questions you guys might have. Having heard all of that, I know a few of you have worked in similar ways or in organizations that are connected to this. So yeah, just feel free to unmute yourselves, and I'll try and make sure that you all get a chance to talk. Karen, you were the first on the unmute button.
Yeah. Thanks, Gabriel, and thanks to everyone. It's really interesting, and I really liked that movement away, you know, from sort of the collaboration to leadership in communities, but also that notion of allies as well, and sort of reflecting when I've worked with social pedagogy students and hearing their stories in the workplace where they might have felt that they were on their own, but actually coming together and reflecting on the work they were doing really added a strength and that motivation to keep going with it. So that really struck a chord with me, the importance of that.
Great, thanks, Karen. That's good to hear. Any other reflections or questions for David, Dawn, and Lewis?
It's Eugenie.
Hey, you're still on your walk?
No, I'm just actually arrived, but waiting here to go in because it starts at 11. No, it's not necessarily a question. It is just a lot of food for thought. I practice in the Netherlands as a social pedagogy, but when I came to the UK, it was not really that much recognized. So I'm very excited actually to see and hear that this movement is actually getting bigger across. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can you still hear me? It is just a stewardship. I think that is something that it comes back into my mind, and maybe there's something that I need to reflect on and see how can I incorporate that in my life, but also in my work life. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks. That's really brilliant to hear. And obviously, you know, I think the fascinating stuff for us is that we've worked hard to kind of develop a social pedagogy community in the UK, and simultaneously there's been lots of work within the public sector, particularly around public management, to develop an HLS community, and we feel that great things can happen when those two communities actually come together and share their learning, their insights, and so that's definitely something that we're looking forward to kind of exploring further. So, and we'll keep you posted.
And Eugenie, I would say, you know, have a look at the new ebook and read Dawn's chapter on the systems element and the systems stewardship, because I think it's something that's really, really important, because you know, we do all play important roles in making sure that those systems stay really healthy and holding each other to account. And how do we do that, not in a negative way, but how do we do that in a positive way, where it's supportive and there's that learning and that development, but also that we are keeping that moral and ethical focus as well. But yeah, I would urge you to have a look at the chapter in the new ebook, and it's free as well, so you can download it for free and read it. But yeah, I think you'll find that helpful.
Thank you.
For me, I think one of the developments I'd really like to see is actually kind of the valuing and resourcing of that stewardship role more. So I think probably people who practice social pedagogy do some of this anyway. It's just so intuitive, but it's always kind of on top of the day job, or seen as on top of the day job. It's normally the stuff that isn't contracted or commissioned or paid for. But actually in the pandemic, this was, you know, the skills that were absolutely crucial to mobilising people in a coordinated way. So for me, it's like, how can we actually get people to recognise the value of this stuff and actually resource and pay for it and recognise it and nurture it, rather than it being done around the edges and seen as something that we know is important, but we will sometimes need to hide because it's not delivering these specified outcomes or targets. So I think charitable funders are starting to fund this work more, but yeah, I think there's a long way to go.
Yeah, certainly. And it's really great to see that you have done so much work with charitable funders to help them think through what could this mean for the way that they award grants, and what are they expecting organizations to do on the back of that. So that's brilliant. Were there any other questions from people? I think Hannah, did you want to ask something as well?
It was more of a comment really than a question, just to say that it was really helpful to hear your thoughts articulated with the links with social pedagogy being so explicitly named, because it feels very instinctive that they are intrinsically linked. So it's just really helpful way that they were set out. And I think what I'm taking away from this is the comment I think that David made around, there was that moment when you sort of found your shared humanity. And I think that's what I'm going to take back, because I think it's very easy, especially as a new provider, to get caught up in old systems, and I'm desperately trying to not get to that stage. And actually, if I can link those conversations to our shared purpose, which we're clear about, and reminding that we have that shared humanity, I think would be a really helpful reflection personally, sort of being able to drive forward. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
And I think as well, Hannah, it's that it's not just the shared ownership. It's for me, it's that where's the behaviour as well. So it's you know, so we can kind of think, we can say we've got it, but I think when we start thinking about, well, where's the behaviour, that keeps us on track then, and we can think, oh, actually, we've kind of lost it a little bit, so we need to get back to that. So I think, again, that, and I think that's why social pedagogy really fits so nicely with human learning systems, because it's about that. How do we develop the shared understanding that Halton and the Lighthouse Project? You've got it in bucket loads, and then so when you've got staff that are joining as a new provider, they sign up to that. But then how do you keep that conversation going to keep reflecting back on where's the behaviour? So how are the kids feeling this? How does it feel? Where, you know, and having conversations with them about when is this demonstrated to them? When do they feel it as well as see it?
Yeah.
Maybe a quick comment, Gabriel, if you don't mind, about the references we've made to healthy system. I think it's important to say that systems are always going to be messy and imperfect and challenging, and sometimes they're going to get us down and get us really down. But when we're talking about a healthy system, we're talking about a system that's open to reflection, that's open to looking at itself, that's always curious about what's happening. And as many people in it as possible can develop the skills that we are recognising are important in system stewardship. So a healthy system is not necessarily a perfect system, but it's a system that's committed and has lots of people within it that are committed to learning and looking at what's happening and consistently changing. So I only said that in recognition that sometimes the work can appear to get stuck and it can be difficult. But the more we can encourage relationships that are focused around that shared moral purpose, the more we'll find the energy to move forward, and we'll see the momentum growing and change does happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's something really interesting there about metaphors, because thinking about systems health almost forces us to think about systems as organisms in the way we might think about our own body, and not as machines. And I think that's a really important thing to differentiate. So, you know, staying healthy requires us to, you know, do ongoing work to be critically reflective about what we might eat, how we might exercise, who we might hang out with, where we might go, how we relax, all of those things, which environment we work in, what's, you know, all the many different factors. And it helps us get away from this thinking of we're all just cogs in a machine, towards we're actually part of an organism that is alive, and we all have a role to play, however small it might be. We can do things to help create the health of the system. So, Dawn, were you going to say something? I was
just going to say, I think your point about ongoing work is really important, because some people think systems change, we'll change the system and then it'll be done and we'll get to this end point. But as David said, it's messy, it's ongoing work, it is an organism, it's constantly evolving. So unlike, you know, funding a project for 2 or 3 years, this is ongoing work that's always needed. You're never going to have a system that's static. It's always going to be evolving and changing. So I think really shifting to that, we're in it for the long-term mindset, this is something we're always going to have to do and invest in, is really important.
And I think for me, I think sometimes people look at me like I'm a bit mad, But I think that's really exciting, right? So I think this complexity and this constant developing, constant learning is actually really exciting. It's not boring for certain, is it? You know, and I think, you know, I know from coming, you know, I'm a social worker, 12 years in practice, and I know that I never knew it all, and I think I never approached my practice as thinking, right, I've got all the answers. Because I think when you think that, then you probably need to give up, because, you know, life is really complex. So I think, again, it's that shifting in mindset, and I think social pedagogy has definitely helped me shift my mindset into thinking that actually complexity and being curious and is actually really interesting. It makes life, you know, that rich tapestry of life is, you know, and humans are interesting. We're all very different, very complex, but again, that can be a real strength, and I think it is about how you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm mindful of time, and that sadly an hour is pretty short for such a rich discussion. So I wanted to leave you with this slide, really, and a nice picture of the ebook, which is available for download for free at realworld.report or at humanlearning.systems, and it's got 300 odd pages of really insightful stuff that's kind of been drawn out of around 50 case studies from a whole range of different organizations. So it makes for a really, really insightful read. And I think the important bit is also that, as Lois just said, we're constantly learning. So all of this is an ongoing development, and that's why it's really important that we encourage you to engage with the different learning communities that are starting to develop around human learning systems. And Dawn and her colleagues at Collaborate are really fantastic in trying to create space for people to form learning communities. And we're in the process of setting up a social pedagogy learning community that looks at HLS and how we can learn together about how we can optimize the systems that we're part of. So stay tuned for further details on that. That's something we'll start to talk a little bit more about quite soon, and hopefully initiate early in the next year. So at this point, that is really probably the best time to say a huge thank you again to David and Lois and Dawn in particular for taking the time to share your insights, and a huge thanks to everybody who's joined us this morning to contribute and to listen and to explore this further with us. I hope you'll join us again for the next few webinars of this series. We'll send you further details about that, and yeah, have a great day. Thanks.